Inflation kills incumbent governments. Just ask Jimmy Carter.
I know how incredibly frustrating and frankly annoying it is to hear politicians say over and over that basically those experiences are wrong. The economy is great. Hi, and welcome to a special bonus Friday episode of The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern.
And I'm Mike Moffatt.
And today we're looking at this week's election of Donald Trump and how the housing crisis contributed to his win.
But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you. Now, normally this would be the part of the show where we talk about what happened, but everyone knows what happened. Donald Trump won the presidential election. I think the more interesting question is why. The morning of the election, our producer Meredith Martin tweeted out a New York Times article, and we'll post a link in the show notes. One line in particular caught her eye, and it caught mine as well, and it said, poll after poll showed that the economy remained the biggest issue, followed by immigration and frustration over the rising prices of groceries and housing. Now, that seems like a pretty reasonable explanation to me, and I know high numbers of Gen Xers who voted for Trump. So, from a millennial perspective, do you buy this explanation?
For sure. I think you can hear economists saying over and over how well the GDP and the stock market is doing. But if you can't afford a home and you can't afford your rent, you can't afford food, you can't afford to raise a family in your 30s, like it doesn't feel true. And I know that the economy is doing great for some people. Like there's a lot of people doing really well out there, and they might be pulling up some of these numbers, and politicians are enjoying seeing the macro data that shows that they're doing well on these markers. But like here in Canada, I keep hearing about how tough it is for anyone to get a job, even though unemployment isn't particularly high. And that's even at the entry level, let alone higher up. And I know how incredibly frustrating and frankly annoying it is to hear politicians say over and over that basically those experiences are wrong. The economy is great. One piece of polling data that caught my eye was that voters that identified the economy as their primary issue voted 79-20 for Trump. And it seems like this has to be coming from inflation and personal experiences, considering, like, as we said, those traditional markers are showing that things have been pretty good the last 4 years. But a quarter of voters have said that inflation caused severe hardships for their families in recent years, and 73% of those people voted for Trump. Did inflation from groceries to home prices actually cost Democrats the election?
Inflation kills incumbent governments. Just ask Jimmy Carter. So, yeah, I believe it played a primary role. It probably wasn't the only thing, but it makes a difference. And there's good research on this. This is not just kind of idle speculation. We'll post a link to the show notes on some of this research. Now, I think what's a little bit less clear is if this vote is simply an anti-incumbent vote, or if economic concerns also cause people's political views to become more conservative. The evidence on that is a little bit less clear. I actually suspect inflation does cause a bit of a rightward shift, but obviously there's counterexamples, like the recent UK election this year. So incumbency is probably the larger factor, but I absolutely think that there's something to the idea of a rightward shift caused by inflation, particularly when it comes to the cost of housing. I've taught fourth year undergraduates almost every year for the last 20 years. And I find it in recent years, my students are on average more anti government than the generation before. That they believe that governments have caused the housing crisis, and the solution to the housing crisis is less government, or at least things, policies that you would normally associate with the political right. Now, I'm not suggesting that they're correct or incorrect, but I am suggesting that based on my own personal experience, their mood has changed from, say, 10 years ago. Now, is this something that you're seeing with your generation?
For sure. I mean, they've been watching announcement after announcement from different levels of government saying this is what's going to solve the housing crisis. And it just keeps getting worse. Right now, like, it doesn't seem like there's any real path to affordability again. It seems like basically you have rich parents, you're fine. Otherwise, you're kind of screwed. And I think that when they hear politicians saying they're going to fix it and ending up making it even more out of their reach, they eventually just go, okay, well, obviously government's the problem here. Every day when I wake up and I start my, daily Twitter doom scrolling session, I see people complain about how unaffordable life is, but there's also always a new tweet from you, pretty much, with a chart. And the day after the election, you posted a chart that said this. Since 2000, Texas and Florida have gained 13 electoral college votes, equivalent to Virginia's votes. This didn't determine the election, but it's a big boost to Republicans. These states build housing in a way New York doesn't, and it's increasing their political clout. Can you walk us through what you meant by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think everybody knows basically how the electoral college works. That every state is assigned a number of points. The winner of the election needs to get 270 of these points in order to become president. Every 10 years, the number of points each state is worth, it changes. It gets reassigned because it's based on the population of the states, how many people live there. And what we've seen over time is some states like New York State, like Illinois, and recently California, they lose electoral college votes, through all these cycles, and they're traditionally blue states. And red states, particularly Texas and Florida to a lesser extent, they've been gaining votes. And what's happening is, particularly between California and Texas, there's this big migration going on. You can imagine a young couple, or even a single person. They're living in the Bay Area. They're living in LA, and they'd like to have a family someday. And they're just like, that's not going to happen here. There's no housing available. What is available is tiny. It's not a place I'm comfortable raising a kid. So they end up moving, and oftentimes they end up moving to Texas. They go to Houston or DFW or Austin. And what that does is, because that sort of population grows, Texas gets more electoral college votes. And that's actually not unique to the United States. We have the same thing happening here in Canada. We recently, for the upcoming election, had all of our electoral ridings, our electoral districts redrawn, and a few added. And because the city of Toronto is growing relatively slowly, they've actually lost a riding in the next election. I think they've gone from 25 to 24, whereas the province of Alberta has gained 3. And why is that? Well, it's because 50,000 people a year have been moving on net from Ontario to Alberta. And that's, more people in Alberta, they get more MPs. Fewer people, or at least disproportionately fewer people in Toronto, they get fewer MPs. So this migration based on housing availability is changing the relative political clout of various provinces and states and communities.
Right now, it seems like that's making, in America, the red states, and here the more conservative provinces and ridings, making them a little more powerful. But I would wonder if over time that would change. If you're getting a bunch of people who are coming from very progressive areas who would traditionally vote Liberal or NDP, moving into areas that are more traditionally conservative, wouldn't you see over time those areas become more towards the center and open to more left-wing parties?
It's certainly possible, and we don't have great research on this, but we do, at least anecdotally, we do see that in some cases. So Austin, Texas is one example where we've seen transplants from California move to Austin, not just for housing, but culture and so on. And it's made a city that was already somewhat progressive, even more progressive. But I actually want to suggest that that's not the norm. And in fact, there are reasons to believe that the effect actually works in the opposite direction, that this migration causes communities to become more conservative. So the first reason is that people moving out of the city of Toronto to Alberta are probably not representative of the average Torontonian. It's kind of a biased sample, as we might say in statistics. And there's this great quote. It's about hockey, not about housing, but I think it illustrates it. And it's from Jack Kent Cooke. And he founded the Los Angeles Kings NHL team, and he was the first owner of the team. And he thought that the Kings would be a great draw because so many Canadians live in California. But in their first season, they didn't have that many fans. And then he concluded this. This is his quote. When I started the Kings, I was told there were 250,000 ex-Canadians in LA. Now I know why they left Canada. They hate hockey. And, it might be that kind of effect happening, that the folks who are leaving Toronto to go to Alberta are inherently more conservative to begin with. So we might not necessarily see the politics of Alberta change. And if you think of, the most conservative Albertans that you've ever met, there's a very good chance that they were born in like North York or Markham or Mississauga. And then secondly, on top of that, it's not clear whether the newcomers change the culture of a place or the place changes the culture of newcomers. So you could think of a scenario where, somebody who lives in downtown Toronto, they move to Calgary, they move to, wherever a more kind of conservative riding in Alberta. Even if they don't start out as conservative, their political views might evolve over time just because of the culture, because of the conversations they have with their neighbors and their new friends and their coworkers and so on. So in short, that effect you described is certainly possible, and I don't want to rule it out. But what we do know is that the outmigration of young people from progressive cities is causing those cities to lose political clout, and it's changing the balance of power and causing more conservative communities to have more political power than they might have had 10 or 20 years ago.
So if those cities don't want to lose that power, like, they must know what the solution is, right?
Well, it sounds like you're hinting at something. So let's hear your solution.
They just need to build more homes, make it easier for people to build a life there and actually be able to raise families there and just stay in a city. And then they won't lose that political power. They can actually keep those seats and not have them all move to other parts of the country, both here and in America.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And I think this really shows the housing as the theory of everything model is absolutely true. So, Toronto, Vancouver, you want to keep your political clout, build more homes.
Thanks so much for watching and listening. And thanks as always to our producer, Meredith Martin.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about housing and politics, please send us an email to missingmiddlepodcast@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.